Okay, so welcome back to this video in which we're discussing the role of the sarcoplasmic reticulum in pathological cardiac hypertrophy. Okay, right, so we're discussing the pathological remodeling of the heart. So we've discussed that if the left ventricle starts to struggle in its job of pumping blood from the left ventricle into the aorta, and then what will happen is that the volume of blood gradually in the left ventricle will increase, and this will increase the pressure or the stress on the wall of the left ventricle. Okay, and this is what's going to drive pathological remodeling. So, what's going to happen then? Well, what we want to do is increase the strength of the walls of the left ventricle. Okay, and the way that we can do this is by increasing the size, you would think, of the thickness of the walls of the left ventricle. However, I've told you that you cannot grow the heart via hyperplasia. So let me just talk to you about the two main forms of growth within the human body. So if you want to make a tissue grow, so let's have a nice simple little tissue down here. So our tissue is going to consist of 4 cells, so nice and simple. Now if you want to make this box of tissue grow, then there are 2 ways you can do it. Either you can make each and every cell in the tissue grow, so you can do this basically. So each of these 4 cells is going to grow, and that's going to mean that the overall tissue is now bigger. This is what's known as hypertrophy. Hypertrophy means that the actual cells themselves are getting bigger, but you're not actually increasing the number of cells. Alternatively, if you want the tissue to grow, you could leave the size of the cells alone and just get more cells, so cause cellular proliferation, and that way you can increase the size of the tissue simply because you've got more cells. This form of growth of a tissue is known as hyperplasia. Okay, now the heart is not capable of hyperplasia. The cells in the heart pretty much do not divide after birth. The cells that you have now are pretty much the ones that you had when you were born. Okay, so instead it must be this form of growth that's going to happen. So what we can do is we can make each one of the cardiomyocytes hypertrophy, i.e. grow, and that will increase the size of the left ventricular wall. Okay, so this is what's going to happen. So if we draw a cardiomyocyte here, so this is our cardiomyocyte, then what's going to happen is it's going to hypertrophy basically, but the way in which it's going to hypertrophy is not the ideal way to hypertrophy. So basically in the human body there are 2 ways that cardiomyocytes can hypertrophy. So if we talk about the 2 ways that cardiomyocytes can hypertrophy, so cardiac hypertrophy. So basically you can divide them up into 2 main types. A form known as eccentric cardiac hypertrophy, eccentric cardiac hypertrophy, and also another form known as concentric cardiac hypertrophy. Okay, now eccentric cardiac hypertrophy, which is a word that I'm struggling to say this morning, eccentric cardiac hypertrophy is the form of hypertrophy that occurs under physiological circumstances. So if you undertake regular exercise, and if you're training maybe to become a world-class athlete, what will happen is your heart will need to be able to pump a greater amount of blood for it in a minute, i.e. you're going to need a greater cardiac output to feed your muscles. Okay, so you need a more powerful heart. In people who are undertaking regular training, you will get physiological cardiac hypertrophy basically. The heart will get bigger, and it is through hypertrophy. The cells will grow, but the way that it works is that the hypertrophy looks like this. So if I draw the new cardiomyocyte, what it will look like is maybe something like this. So this is eccentric cardiac hypertrophy. Okay, so here's our original cardiomyocyte. And then after you've undertaken the eccentric cardiac hypertrophy, you can see that its length has increased hugely, but its width has not increased that much. Its width will increase a tiny bit, but its length is the main thing which has increased. This is eccentric cardiac hypertrophy, not concentric cardiac hypertrophy. And the form of hypertrophy we're going to get in our pathological cardiac hypertrophy is not this. It's concentric cardiac hypertrophy. So concentric cardiac hypertrophy is the form that occurs in pathological cardiac hypertrophy, and it's what's going to happen in response to the heart struggling to actually perform its role. Okay, there's two other names for these two forms of cardiac hypertrophy, so we can either call it eccentric, physiological, or also you can call it adaptive cardiac hypertrophy, whereas concentric / pathological cardiac hypertrophy has another name which is maladaptive. So both of them aim to make the cardiomyocytes stronger, basically, and therefore make the walls of the heart stronger. But eccentric or physiological or adaptive cardiac hypertrophy is the only one that actually achieves a greater cardiac output in the long run. They're both going to actually have a beneficial effect initially, but this one will deteriorate very quickly, and we'll discuss that more in a moment. So, we'll do away now with eccentric / physiological / adaptive cardiac hypertrophy. So forget that one now, because we're discussing this one, what happens in pathological remodeling. So forget this, except to compare and contrast it to concentric. Okay, so what's going to happen in concentric cardiac hypertrophy is the exact opposite. The width of the cardiomyocyte is going to increase hugely, and the length is not going to increase that much at all. So the cardiomyocytes all become much thicker, but they don't become that much longer. So that's why this is called concentric cardiac hypertrophy. Now, what therefore happens in both of these cases of cardiac hypertrophy is that when you lengthen all the cardiomyocytes, basically if we look at our picture of the heart, all the cardiomyocytes will be like this, okay? So here's this little rectangle of a cardiomyocyte. When you lengthen them all, what's going to happen? Well, you're effectively going to increase the length of these chambers. So, to draw what happens in eccentric / physiological / adaptive cardiac hypertrophy, on the level of the entire heart, if we draw a nice simple picture, so we draw this as our heart, here are our 4 chambers. What basically happens is the heart becomes longer. Just like the cardiomyocytes, each cardiomyocyte is becoming longer. The heart becomes longer, and that increases the size of these chambers, okay? Whereas in concentric cardiac hypertrophy, here's our original heart here, okay? And it's not going to become any bigger, so the actual size of the heart from the outside stays exactly the same. And I know I've just drawn it a little bit smaller, but it stays exactly the same. And what instead happens is the walls of the heart all become thicker, okay? And they just impede in on the chambers within, basically. And that's what happens in concentric cardiac hypertrophy. So the chambers in concentric cardiac hypertrophy actually become smaller. So pathological cardiac hypertrophy doesn't look as good as physiological cardiac hypertrophy, and it's not. Okay, so all of this, well, not all, but a lot of your cells have undergone, let's say, this concentric cardiac hypertrophy now. And that's made the wall of the left ventricle much, much thicker. Okay, so it's impeding in on the chamber of the left ventricle. Now, what does this achieve? Well, it does actually increase the force which the left ventricular wall is capable of producing, but only temporarily is the problem. It works for a while. The heart's not stupid. It did solve the problem for a while, but something deteriorates in these concentrically hypertrophied cardiomyocytes, and it means that overall what happens is if we plot their function as a function of time, so let's say this is time, okay, right, so let's say it starts off as a normal cardiomyocyte. So this is the function, or the amount of force that the cardiomyocyte is capable of generating. So this is a normal cardiomyocyte here. Let's say the cardiomyocyte now undergoes concentric cardiac hypertrophy here. So this is the point at which it undergoes the concentric hypertrophy. Okay, then what's going to happen is temporarily the force which that cardiomyocyte that's undergone this concentric hypertrophy is capable of generating will go up. So the force will temporarily go up, but then what will happen is it will gradually fall back down, and it won't just fall back down to what it originally was, it'll fall back down to a lower level, basically, like so. So what happens is these are transiently solve the problem. They do transiently produce a wall that is capable of generating a greater amount of force. However, in the long run, what happens is the actual force that this cell is capable of generating goes down to below what it was capable of generating before it actually underwent the concentric hypertrophy. Okay, so what we now want to study is why. Why does the force within these concentrically hypertrophied cardiomyocytes go down like that? Okay, so we'll continue this discussion in the next video.